Let's try to understand what is a prototype and proto in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, the prototype is a fundamental concept. Every object in JavaScript has a prototype. So what I said, every object in JavaScript has a prototype. And the prototype itself is an object. It means that the prototype will have its own properties and methods. So we said that every object in JavaScript has a prototype. What about the primitive types, something that's not an object? So does it have a prototype? So let's see with an example. So let's say, for example, we have an array, okay, of numbers. So I can say var numbers equal to, for example, this. Now let's print these numbers. So now this array is an object in JavaScript. So let's expand this. So when we expand this, we see all the properties and methods of numbers object, this array object. So here is a property called length, and now here is another property called prototype. As I said earlier, an object in JavaScript will have its own prototype. So here, this numbers object has a prototype property. When we expand this prototype property, we see lots of functions on prototype, not on the array object, but on the prototype of array object. So all these functions are not directly attached to numbers. They are attached to the prototype of this numbers array. Although these functions are attached to the prototype of array, we can use these functions directly on this array, which is numbers. So when we say numbers dot, we can see that all these prototype methods are now available directly on numbers. Although they are not directly attached to numbers, they are part of numbers prototype. So we can say numbers.sort, for example, and now we got this sorted array. Okay, so we saw that these functions of prototype basically slide to the actual object. But what will happen with the primitive data types, like for example, a string, number, boolean, null, or undefined? So let's create a string data type. So let's say, for example, name equal to, and I can say Navendu. So this is a string. If I just print name here, okay, Navendu got printed. But we cannot expand this. Okay, but at the same time, I can say name dot, for example, length. Okay, so now we got 7. So where did this length come from? Okay, it came from the prototype, but name is not an object. So how we are still able to access length? Because when JavaScript sees that we are trying to call a method or a function or a property on a primitive type, it basically converts this primitive type into object first and then tries to call this property or method on the object. So what happens when doing so, the JavaScript will first try to find the method on the object itself. If it cannot find the method on the object itself, it will go one step above to its prototype and see if that method is available on its prototype. If it is not available, then it will go one step up because the prototype is an object. So prototype can have its own prototype. Okay, so forming a prototype chain, it will continue going that prototype chain until it finds that method. If it does not find that method, it will throw an exception saying that that method is not available on the object. And the root of all the prototypes is the object itself. So in this case, what will happen is first name will get converted to an object. So it will be something like new string and then Navendu, and now it will call length here. Now this is an object. And because it is an object, we can expand it to see its properties and methods. And now this object, as I said earlier, every object in JavaScript will have its own prototype. So now this is the prototype for this object. And we can see that this prototype has lots of methods on it. Okay. And here is the length property that we were trying to use earlier, giving us 7. So in short, what we learned so far is every object in JavaScript has a property called prototype. So what is underscore underscore proto? So underscore proto is also called dunder proto. Dunder means it has two underscore before and after proto. So we call it dunder proto. So dunder proto is nothing but a property that gives us the reference of prototype, actual prototype object. And this is not actually the recommended approach by ECMAScript. So if we need to find the actual prototype of a particular object, we don't use dunder proto anymore. So we can do this name.dunder proto like this, and it will give us the reference of the prototype. But there is another recommended approach of getting the prototype, and that's called Object.getPrototypeOf. So I can say Object.getPrototypeOf, and we just pass name, for example, whose prototype we are trying to find. Okay, so this will give the same result as underscore proto underscore underscore. Using dunder proto directly is discouraged for several reasons, including potential performance issues, and in fact, it is not part of official ECMAScript standard. It is better to use recommended methods. We can have prototype property on all kinds of objects, including built-in object and custom object. So now let's create our own object and see the value of the prototype. Now let's create a class called person. Okay, so now the person can have a name, and in the constructor we'll just take name, for example, and we can set this dot name equal to name. So now this is the class. Now let's create a person here. Now let's create an object. Person1 is new person, and let's call this guy John, for example. Okay, so here is the person1, and now let's try to find the prototype of, let's first print person1. So let's say console.log person1, and let's save this. See what we got. So here is our object. So this object, this is a custom object. So this object will also have its own prototype. Let's expand this object and see the prototype. Okay, so here is the prototype of the person object. So let's expand this, and we can see that there is a constructor and a prototype. So we got a prototype chain here. So person has a prototype. This prototype also has a prototype. If we expand this, we can see that there are lots of functions and a proto property on this object prototype. So this is how the prototype chaining is. So the person has its own prototype. This prototype has its own prototype. So we can call these functions directly on person. So we can say person dot something to a string, for example. What JavaScript will try to do, it will try to find to a string function on person itself. It will not find to a string function on the person itself. It will try to find to a string on its prototype. It's not there. So it will go to the prototype of prototype, and then it will try to find to a string there, and it will find that. So it will execute to a string on person. So we can say person1 dot to a string. If I do this, so we got this particular data. So this is how prototype chaining works. Here we have created this person object from this person class, but behind the scene, this person class gets actually converted into the constructor function. So what is a constructor function? It is a function that constructs an object. So behind the scene, it will look something like this: function, this, and the name of the class like this. So now this became the constructor function. So this is the constructor function. It is similar to class syntax. So behind the scene, what it does is it actually creates this kind of constructor function. So let's save this and let's see the result. So we should see that the result should be exactly the same as before. Now let's try to get the prototype for person1. So we can say something like Object.getPrototypeOf and person1. Okay, let's console.log this. Console.log. Save it. So we are getting the prototype of person1. Okay, and this points to this prototype. Okay, so they both are exactly the same, and we can verify this. We can actually verify if they both are same or not. So we can do something like a strict equality here like this, and we can say person1 dot underscore underscore proto underscore underscore. Let's save it and see we got true here. So in fact, this get prototype of gives us exactly the same reference as this dunder proto. So what we learned is dunder proto is nothing but it gives a reference of the actual prototype of an object, and this is not a recommended approach anyway. Okay, so rather than writing underscore underscore proto, we would use this method, helper method called get prototype of or set prototype of. In fact, there is a property on this constructor function called prototype. So we can say something like person.prototype. Let's see. So console.log, we can just print person.prototype. Okay, let's save this, and we got the same result here. So this prototype, person.prototype, is pointing to this particular object. In JavaScript, there are two ways to implement inheritance. One is using classes, and the other by using prototype chaining. And classes by default behind the scene uses prototype chaining only. So prototype chaining has an abstraction called classes on top of it. Inheritance is basically used to reduce code duplication. So we don't have to write same code over and over again. In other languages like Java or C Sharp, we use class for inheritance. But in JavaScript, we can do the same with or without classes. So JavaScript as a language does not have the concept of class. Class is just a keyword here. So class was introduced in JavaScript as part of ECMAScript 2015, which is also called ES6. So in JavaScript, classes are just a level of abstraction of our prototype model. So let's start by seeing an example of implementing inheritance using classes. Let's suppose there is a company. Now, company has multiple employees. It can have thousands of employees. It can also have multiple managers. Managers are also employees, just a special type of employees. Okay, manager can do certain things that a regular employee cannot do. Like for example, manager can hire some employee, it can terminate some employees, but a regular employee cannot hire and fire. So manager as an employee just has some extra features that a regular employee do not have. So let's create a class for employee, and we will see how we can extend that employee class to add new features and create a manager class. So let's create an employee class, something like this. Okay, so now this is an employee class. Now employee class has two properties, name and in office, and two methods, login and logout. When we create an employee object, we will initialize the name of the employee and we will set in office equal to false. But when the employee will log in, we will set in office to true and we will just print that this guy is in office. And when he will log out, we will just set in office to false and console.log that this guy is not in office. That's it. Simple. So now let's create two employees. Okay. One we will call John and other we will call Amit. So let him one, for example, and this is new employee, and we will call this name, for example, John. Okay. Similarly, we will have another employee, employee 2, and we will call this guy Amit. Okay, so now we have two employees. Now let's create an array that will hold all employees of this company. So and we will call this employees. Okay, and this is an array, so it will have emp1 comma emp2. Perfect. So now these are the two employees of the company. Let's console.log employees. So let's say console.log employees, and let's save and see the result here. Let's expand this array. So we have John and Amit here. Okay, so there are two employees. So now employee 1 can log in and log out. Same employee 2 can also log in and log out. So let's see. So we can call employee 1 dot login. If we do that, it says John is in office. Okay. Similarly, we can log out. John. We can say logout. Okay, now John is not in office. Perfect. So let's create another class called manager. So class manager. So this is, oh, let's make M as capital. Okay. Now the manager is also an employee. It means that he will also have a name, and this flag in office will also be available in manager. Also, manager can log in and log out. So one way of creating manager class is to just copy paste this whole thing that is already present in the employee and add additional methods, additional functionalities that manager can perform, like for example, terminate employee. But that will lead to code duplication. We don't want to repeat our code. So let's try to inherit manager from employee. And the way we do that by using extends keyword. So we can say something like class manager extends employee, something like this, extends and employee. So what we just did is we are now making manager as the child of employee class. It means that now manager will have all the public property and methods of employee class available to itself. So manager can also log in, manager can also log out. In addition to the parent methods, manager can also have its own methods that will only be available to the manager kind of object. So let's create a method for manager called terminate employee. So like this, terminate employee, and we will pass the employee to terminate. Okay, so what we will do is we will just use this employee array, okay, and we will remove this employee from this array. So all we need to do is to filter out this particular employee from this array and update the array. So we can say something like employees is equal to employees and dot filter on name, for example. So here we can have this lambda expression. We can see that e dot name is not equal to emp dot name. Now let's create a manager. Okay, so let manager equal to new manager. Let's name this guy Ashish. A manager is also an employee of this company. Let's put manager here. Okay, let's save this, and we can see here we have now two employees and a manager. Okay, let's expand this. So here these two guys, John and Amit, are of the type employee, and Ashish is of the type manager. Let's expand this first object. Okay, so we can see that this first object has in office and name attached to it. But where is this login and logout? Okay, so there is a third property here called prototype. Let's expand prototype. And we can see that login and logout, they are not directly attached to employee object. Rather, they are attached to its prototype. Remember, prototype is the property of employee. So these two methods went to the prototype of employee rather than on employee itself. Now let's see manager. Let's expand this manager object. So now we can see that manager also has in office and name properties. Why? Because it got these two properties from its parent, which is employee. So employee has these two properties. Okay, now let's see if manager has login and logout as well. So let's expand this prototype of manager. Here we can see it has terminate employee. Let's expand this prototype property, and here we can see login and logout. So we can see a chain of prototype. This is what we call prototype chaining. Let's see what will happen if John, which is employee 1, tries to terminate employee 2. So can we do this? Can we do employee 1 dot terminate employee 2? Okay, is it valid? Okay, save this and see what happens. No, it is not valid. We got an exception here. It says that employee 1 dot terminate employee is not a function. Okay, which makes sense because employee is of the type employee class. Employee class does not have terminate employee. It only has login and logout. So terminate employee is only on manager class. So only a manager type of object can call this terminate employee method. So rather than employee 1 here, we need to say manager. Okay, manager.terminate employee, and now it worked. It did not throw any exception. Now let's see what will happen if we print employees. So obviously this particular employee, which is employee 2, got terminated, so he will not be in this list. So let's save this and see what happens. Before termination, at line number 33, this got printed out. So now we had 2 employee and 1 manager. Now the second employee got fired, so now we have only 1 employee and 1 manager. So this is how we actually do inheritance in JavaScript using classes. Okay, using extends. We use extends keyword to perform inheritance in JavaScript using classes. Now, before we move to the next section, let's try to understand how an object gets created. When we do new employee, what happens behind the scene? So when we new up a class, okay, to create an object, three things happen. First, an empty object gets created. Okay, so when we say new employee John, first thing that happens is an empty employee object will get created. So let's write it here. So first thing is empty object gets created. Okay. Second is this keyword. Here is this. This will get assigned to that empty object. Okay. So here we can say this points to empty object. And third, constructor gets called. Constructor is called. These are the three things. So this is the constructor method that will get called. So take for example, when we create this first employee, then the first thing that happens is a new employee object will get created. Okay. And the second thing will happen is this here, this will point to that particular empty object. It means this will point to employee one, EMP1. Okay. So when we call this, we are calling basically EMP1, and then constructor is getting called. It means that EMP1 dot name will become name, emp1 dot in office will become false. Same thing will happen when we create a new employee, Amit. So here, first thing will happen is that a new blank employee object will get created, and now this will point to emp2, and then constructor will get called. It means emp2 dot name will become Amit, and emp2 dot in office will become false. So this is how we create inheritance using classes in JavaScript. Next section, we are going to see constructor function. So classes, as we said, is just a syntactic sugar of her prototype. So what happens is JavaScript, when it sees a class, it basically converts this into something called constructor function. And the way it will do it is it will just take this here and write function, and now it will replace constructor with the actual class name, which is employee. So this is what we call constructor function. So it is basically used to construct an employee type of object, and the creation will happen like before only, no change. So we can still do something like this here, something like this, to create two different employees. Okay, now we will move this login and logout to the constructor function itself. So let's do this. Let's move first this login here. So we can say this dot login equal to function. Okay, and now similarly, let's attach this dot logout here, function, this, and let's copy paste this. Okay, so now this class got converted into this constructor function called employee. We create an object from the constructor function the same way we create object from the class, like this. Okay, so now let's print employee 1 and employee 2. So let's say, for example, here, if I say emp1, so let's see what happens. So here, okay, emp1. Now we can see that here, the login and logout, these two functions got directly attached to the employee object itself, which is not a good practice. We can move this login and logout from object to its prototype. And the way we can do it by attaching this login and logout to the prototype of employee itself. So we can say something like employee dot prototype dot login, something like this. We can just cut this one and paste here. That's it. And we remove login from here. Okay, so now we can see that logout is still part of the constructor function, but we moved login to its prototype. Okay, so let's see now what is emp1. So emp1, expand it. Now we can see that login is gone from the object itself, and let's expand the prototype property. We can see login moved here. Let's similarly move logout from here. Let's cut it and put it here, employee dot prototype dot, now remove this from here. Okay, so now logout also got moved from the object itself to its prototype. So let's see emp1. Okay, so employee only has these two properties, and these login and logout methods now are part of its prototype. Perfect. Now let's create the constructor function for manager. So we will do the same function manager. Manager will also take a name. Okay, now manager has a method called terminate employee. So we can attach terminate employee not directly to the manager constructor function, but to its prototype, the same way we did here. So let's call here manager dot prototype dot this terminate employee. Let's copy from here and move it here. Okay, let's see what's the error. Okay, so now we need to say here function, and here will be emp. We'll remove this emp from here. Okay, so let's save this. So this is gone. Perfect. So now we have this manager constructor function, and terminate employee is now attached to the prototype of manager. Now we need to make this manager subclass of employee, and how we can do that using constructor function. So let's first create the manager object, something like this. Okay, the creation part will not change. And now let's do this, the same thing here. Let's create this array here and now close this. Perfect. So we just copied, pasted everything except the constructor function from the old file. Now let's make manager the subclass of employee. And the way we will do it by just calling from here inside the constructor function employee dot call. We will just call the employee and passing all these parameters, including this. And we will say this dot name. Okay. Now what is this here? Remember, this points to the current object. Okay. So now here inside this manager constructor function, what is this? This is the manager object. So this points to the manager object. So when we pass this here to the employee, this becomes manager. Okay, because this changes based upon the context. So here we need to pass manager here. This is how we create inheritance chain in JavaScript using constructor function. So this is same as extents that we saw earlier using classes. Now let's save this and let's see what we get here. So we got array of 2 employees and 1 manager. Let's expand it and see employee John. Okay, login and logout will be in its prototype. Here is login and logout. Good. So employee has all these methods and properties correctly. Now let's see the manager. Let's expand manager, Ashish. Okay, so as expected, manager also got in office and name, which is coming from employee. Good. Now let's expand its prototype. So now we can see that the prototype has this terminate employee because that's what we attach to manager prototype. So this is also good. But where is login and logout? So let's go one step further. Let's see the prototype of prototype. Okay, I don't see this login and logout anywhere now. So we are definitely missing something. So what happened here is that this login and logout are basically attached to the employee's prototype. We have so far only got employee's properties, which is name and in office. So now we need to attach login and logout from the prototype of employee to the prototype of manager, the same way we did here. So what we can do is we can say manager dot prototype. So the way we do it, we will just create a copy of it. Object.create, and let's create an object, a copy of employee prototype. So we can say employee dot prototype. By doing this, what we are doing is like we are inheriting the employee's prototype to manager prototype. And here we are attaching an extra method called terminate employee to manager prototype. So what will happen is manager prototype will now have 3 methods. 2 will come from employee prototype and 1 is terminate employee, which is the personal method for manager. Okay, but regular employees will have only 2 methods, login and logout. Make sense? Let's save this and now let's see if we got login and logout for manager as well. Okay, so let's expand this. Let's expand manager Okay, as expected, we have these two properties coming from employee to manager. Now let's expand the prototype of manager. So now prototype has this terminate employee. Perfect. Now let's expand this prototype of this prototype. Now we can see login and logout coming from employee. Okay, so we can say manager.login and it should work. So let's say, for example, manager.login and see Ashish is in office. It worked because this login actually came from employee. Similarly, we can say manager.logout. Log out. Perfect. So it is working. Ashish is not in office. So this is how we implement inheritance using prototype chaining. Hope this video was a helpful understanding how we use inheritance in JavaScript using both classes, extents, and prototype chaining.